So thank you very much to everyone at Mnemoscape for the opportunity to speak and to speak under in such an interesting context. So I'm just going to very quickly jump into saying something about Blanchot and Blanchot's conception of the trace. It's true that in Blanchot's work there's not an explicit presentation of the archive. Nevertheless, there's a discovery or an assertion of a set of principles that I would say intersect with or complicate our conception of how an archive functions. Okay. The conception of the trace that appears intermittently across the work of Maurice Blanchot is put to work in such a way that it fundamentally reconfigures what is ordinarily understood by this term. Whenever it is invoked by Blanchot and exposed to the idiom of his writing, the trace is left bearing a fundamentally different set of attributes, is inscribed within a different set of relations. Not only does this reconfiguration touch upon the meaning, function and structure of the concept in question, it extends to encompass the overarching presuppositions upon which such meaning, function and structure rest. Further still, it may well be that whatever is tied to the trace, transmitted through the trace, or responsible for safeguarding the trace, writing, for example, and the institutional form of the book to which writing gives rise, it may well be that these latter will themselves in turn be affected by the trace in its reconfigured form. It is in the course of his 1973 text, The Step Not Beyond, Le Pas Au-delà, that the schema in question receives its most expansive treatment, even if the latter appears dispersed across a series of non-contiguous fragments. In any case, from its first invocation onwards, the question for Blanchot concerns what it is precisely that any trace is a trace of, and his answer to this question is paradoxical in the extreme. The trace, it is made immediately clear, is not to be considered the indexical sign of a past actuality. It is not that through which this actuality is confirmed as having once happened, not that by which the latter's having taken place is underwritten and underscored. What the trace brings before us does not allow us to say, this once was. It does not serve as a proof for the latter. Nor then, it necessarily follows, is the trace of the order of retention or preservation. It does not facilitate a return to the once present but now absent. It is not a means through which a past actuality extends itself or sends something of itself beyond its own present moment, so as to become present once more in the here and now, thereby drawing a line of continuity between two otherwise distinct temporal orders. The trace does not hold open a relation between what once was and what now is. But what is a trace then, if irreducible to none of the above determinations? This is Blanchot's enigmatic answer to the question. The trace pertains to the non-occurrence, the unreality, the inexistence of that which it traces. A trace is left only insofar as what it is a trace of has not taken place. This and this alone is what the trace traces, that which has not occurred, that which did not come to pass, that which never acceded to itself as something present to itself. Taking place, avoir lieu, is necessarily lacking from whatever has been traced. And there is a trace only on account of this lack. No doubt the trace retains, in one way or another, a referential function here. It refers back to something that in a certain sense precedes it, and that in another sense still it follows on from. And yet, writes Blanchot, this is a quote, the trace does not refer to any initial presence that would still be present as remainder or vestige there where it has disappeared. End quote. The trace signifies then the falling away, the withdrawal of its referent, a withdrawal that is always already underway because at no point was it ever present, and this consigns whatever it traces to a form of absence that is not simply the absence of presence. If that which happens leaves no trace, and that which doesn't happen does, then the trace will always demarcate a certain threshold between occurrence and non-occurrence, the actual and the inactual, without thereby conceding any instance of symmetry, any point of correspondence between what lies on either side of this divide. Now, since the trace concerns the non-occurrence of whatever it traces, we can understand why for Blanchot effacement or erasure is its principal modality, its principal form. A trace is left by what has not occurred in the form of effacement. And yet whatever is traced in this way is therefore subject to the following aporia. If it finds itself effaced by the trace, this is without its having ever been present. This enigmatic idea is already announced with the opening invocation of the trace, as it appears in the Step Not Beyond. And I'll provide these quotations since they're not particularly easy to follow. Effaced before being written, Blanchot writes there. And what follows is his key schema of what he takes a trace to be. If the word trace can be admitted, it is as the mark that would indicate as erased what was, however, never traced. The mark that would indicate as erased what was, however, never traced. All our writing, for everyone, and if it were ever writing of everyone, would be this: the anxious search for what was never written in the present, but in a past to come. The effacement that characterises the work of the trace here does not then situate itself in relation to an initial presence, not even negatively. If it effaces what was never traced, this is insofar as it does not proceed on the basis of coordinates provided by the present. The trace does not restore what it traces to presence, but redoubles its absence. And we see here the extent to which writing is itself encompassed by this aporetic schema. In fact, one could say that writing is for Blanchot nothing other than the attempt to bear this aporia whilst conceding as little as possible to its resolution. The consequences of all this, of the exposure of writing to this play of the trace, continue to be taken up in the subsequent course of the Step Not Beyond. So, two quotations. Writing is not destined to leave traces, but to erase by traces all traces, to disappear in the fragmentary space of writing more definitively than one disappears in the tomb, or again to destroy invisibly without the uproar of destruction. Everything must efface itself. Everything will efface itself. This in accordance with the infinite demand or the infinite exigency of effacement that writing take place and takes its place. Even if writing leaves traces, and leaving them makes traces engender themselves and produce themselves out of the life of traces, one can answer, to write is to go by the way of the world of traces, towards the effacement of traces and of all traces, since traces are opposed to totality and always already disperse themselves. If the line of thought that announces itself in these fragments is so disconcerting, is it not at least in part because it speaks of writing as something destined to disappear in the space that is proper to it, in the space that is reserved for it? Wouldn't this mean that the fragmentary space of writing is less a repository, is less a storehouse, than a means of facilitating the disappearance of whatever passes through it? And doesn't this unsettle in turn the fundamental premise underpinning what we ordinarily understand the function of this space to be? In any case, if these questions impose themselves, it is insofar as writing is tied to the idiomatic schema of the trace as Blanchot is conceiving it here. And we can see that this schema circumscribes the act of writing with at least two further imperatives here. Firstly, writing is charged with the task of not producing but erasing the trace. And to undertake this effacement, it has nothing to call upon but the trace itself. Even though writing is not reducible to the trace alone, the space not beyond has much to say, in fact, about writing's relationship to the mark, for example. It is only through the trace that the erasure of the trace can be enacted, that the erasure of the trace can be pursued and undertaken. Secondly, the effacement in question here pertains to the trace insofar as it is plural, insofar as there is always more than one. Effacement concerns not one, but all traces. In that sense, there's no outside to this process. Effacement concerns not one but all traces, and yet these traces taken together do not comprise a totality. How then could we possibly recognize such an act of writing? An act of writing guided by these imperatives, how would it come to show itself as such? It's here, by way of an ending, that we can refer to an enigmatic and yet entirely lucid scene that appears in Nabokov's The Real Life of Sebastian Knight. In truth, what we're going to refer to is no more than a fleeting episode in the course of the novel's events, but it is one that nevertheless gives an intimation of the form of writing that has given itself over to the trace. So, the novel concerns its narrator's attempt to recount the biography of the eponymous fictional author, Sebastian Knight. But the more the fragments of the latter's life are sifted through and pieced together, the more it becomes apparent the extent to which this life has been lived under the sign of effacement. And this is the context in which, in the wake of Sebastian's death, our narrator chances upon an example of this fictional author's writing, whose remarkable idiom is presented to the reader as follows. I won't get through reading this without making a mistake because it's impossible to verbalise. You'll see. Between some legal documents, I found a slip of paper on which he, Sebastian, had begun to write a story. There was only one sentence, stopping short, but it gave me the opportunity of observing the queer way Sebastian had, in the process of writing, of not striking out the words he had replaced by others. So that, for instance, the phrase I encountered ran thus: "As he a heavy sleeper, Roger Rogerson, old Rogerson bought, old Rogers bought, so afraid, being a heavy sleeper, old Rogers was so afraid of missing tomorrows. He was a heavy sleeper, he was mortally afraid of missing tomorrow's event, glory, early, train, glory. So what he did was to buy and bring home to buy that evening and bring home not 1 but 8 alarm clocks of different sizes and vigour, of ticking 9, 8, 11 alarm clocks of different sizes, ticking which alarm clocks, 9 alarm clocks, as a cat has 9, which he placed, which made his bedroom look rather like a..." I was sorry it stopped here. Do we not encounter here a demonstration of writing that has abandoned itself without reserve to the trace? A writing that erases the traces of which it is comprised through those very same traces. Of course, everything rests here upon the withdrawal of the gesture of striking out, which nevertheless remains tied to every word in this passage as that which has not occurred. The absence of the line that should run across the abandoned words, the mark by which this abandonment would be confirmed and actualised. The absence of this mark can only be understood here on the basis of Blanchot's definition of the trace, which, just to repeat, is the mark that would indicate as erased what was never traced. In refraining from carrying out the gesture of striking out, the words that the author has abandoned and the words that he has elected to keep here are left indistinguishable at the level of the sign. They precisely cannot be told apart. What falls within this writing and what is cast outside of it, what is excluded from it, is ceaselessly drawn at each stage, to the point where the simple content of what is being recounted is constantly unfounded. Which means that each word is present here, one as much as the next, and all together, only insofar as each is synonymous with its own effacement. And this, surely, is one way in which writing would disappear in the fragmentary writing of space. Thank you.